Thank you very much, Beth, for that very kind introduction. And again, I'd like to extend my thanks to all of the panel and the organising committee from eFutures and IIT this morning for pulling together this event, which will hopefully lead to some really positive discussions. I'm hoping that my screen is sharing properly on your side. If it isn't, if somebody could let me know. But just in terms of kind of kicking off, as I realise I'm on the wrong slide, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this morning. I think we have some really interesting discussions to have around hydrogen, the role that hydrogen will have in our emerging economies, and particularly the role it will have as we start to move towards our net zero goals for 2050. So as a kind of a kickoff and kind of positioning where I'm sitting in this kind of domain, I'd like to talk about some of these challenges from my own perspective, which is really about the future role of hydrogen in our public transport sector. And I'll admit now that I may end up posing many more questions than I give solutions, because we're really in the middle of a uniquely disruptive period of time in transport. But it actually makes it an incredibly exciting time to be involved, as we have so many opportunities available to us. And hopefully I can give you a flavour of some of that this morning. So before we kind of get into the meats of the technology solutions, I just wanted to start with positioning kind of where I feel transport sits. So I particularly like this quotation from Robin Chase, who was the co-founder of the US firm Zipcar and Buzzcar, among many other ventures. Transportation is at the centre of the world. It is the glue of our daily lives. And when it goes well, we don't see it. And I think when we start to look at technology and technology solutions, it can be very easy sometimes to lose sight of what they're there to deliver. And I like to kind of always reflect back on, why are we doing something? What is the ethos behind it? And is this the right decisions that we're making? And when we look at our transportation sector more widely, it's going to have a huge role to play when we're looking at achieving progress against our UN Sustainable Development Goals. So fundamentally, when we talk about transport, we're talking about moving people, the access to employment, access to education, participation in social activities, and access to healthcare. We've seen links being drawn through Department for Transport studies that have shown that there are direct correlations between access to good transport linkages and positive mental health. So it plays a huge role in our society. But what we're also seeing is forecasts that the general demand on our transport services are likely to grow. There's been forecasts coming out from Siemens that are saying that we may see up to a 300% growth in transport demand by the year 2050. That is going to place huge demands on both providing sustainable transport solutions, but also how we meet the energy demand that's needed to service that. So this is going to raise a whole new generation of problems. Where do we get the energy from to service this demand, while also meeting our zero emission ambitions? So I'm going to use the UK as a kind of a case study to paint a picture here in terms of where we're at with our transportation systems as it sits today. When I say today, I actually mean pre-pandemic in 2019. We'll talk a little bit why that is going through. So if we look 2019, where we were at transportation statistics, 27% of our UK greenhouse gases could be attributable to transportation here, and 23% of our domestic nitrous oxide emissions, which was equating to roughly 122 million tonnes of equivalent CO2. So the impact of transport on greenhouse gases and us attempting to meet our net ambition goals is huge. It's one of the biggest emitters in the UK. And then 2020 happened and we entered into pandemic. Over the last 18 to 24 months, we've seen really significant changes in transport behaviour. There's been a 33% reduction in passenger miles travelled across our systems. But about 92% of all passenger kilometres are now being travelled in cars, vans and taxis. We're starting to see a change and a shift in behaviour, which is away from what we wanted, where we had many public policies over a long period of time, which was trying to displace private transportation and encourage public transport. The pandemic has actually seen us starting to move back on that. We're becoming even more reliant on personal transport, and we're seeing that reflected in current public transport statistics. There's been a reduction in rail miles of 80% and a reduction in bus miles of 58%. However, while that was quite negative through 2020 and the early part of 2021, we're starting to see these moving back up again. And we do have an opportunity now to reflect on how we design our public transport systems and how we can start to introduce these big transformative changes in the future. So Some examples of this have been in the lead up to COP26, many global nations started to publish their own initiatives, their own commitments to decarbonisation of their transport systems and decarbonisation of their countries as a whole. The UK Department for Transport published their decarbonisation of transport plan back in July 2021, and they laid out a significant number of commitments towards developing pathways towards net zero in transport. And what you can see these are just summarised on the screen, is there's massive challenges in here. This isn't little things, this isn't little shifts. The scale of our national, let alone international transport system is vast. We have decarbonisation challenges across our spectrum of ground, sea and land transportation, and we're touching on most aspects of those across most of the talks this morning. What we have seen, however, is an interesting change in the language that's being used when we discuss our decarbonisation pathways. Up until the last year, when we talked about decarbonisation in transport, it was very much low emission, ultra low emission, where we were still quite heavily reliant on diesel. But when we start to see the commitments that are coming out now, the word zero emission are being used throughout. And that's an area that we've been very heavily focused on here in Queens, how we can develop zero emission solutions, specifically within the Bus Technology Centre. And that's something that I'd like to talk about a little bit more now, where the challenges lie and where the opportunities will lie for us as we start to see hydrogen more of a viable prospect within the bus transportation sector. So there are roadmaps that exist for technology development in public transport. And it's not a battery versus hydrogen race. And I know that this is something that comes up quite a bit. Why are we going down the hydrogen route? We have battery technologies. In our sector, in public transport, in the bus sector and specifically, there has been long acceptance that there's going to be a blend of technologies needed to really meet our net ambition goals. And that over the next 20 years, the management of the introduction of battery and other technology solutions is going to bring complications. So the roadmaps on the board are based on roadmaps that have been developed through the Advanced Propulsion Centre, which are taking in impact from academia, from OEMs, from suppliers, from operators. And they're based on where we expect to see various technology solutions at mass market level, not that these solutions don't already exist in smaller scale pilot studies. So the first of these is obviously the battery electric technology. It's the benchmark. And if we look globally, there's roughly 400,000 battery electric buses in operation globally, about 1,000 or so of those in the UK. And there's actually a projection that we're likely to see the biggest battery electric bus fleet in the whole of Europe in the UK by 2024. They're talking about 180% growth between now and end of 2024. We're going to continue to see a significant role for battery electric buses in our future bus fleets, and particularly in urban centres, in city centres, in towns, in large, well-developed urban environments. We'd also expect to see next generation battery solutions emerging to help support this. The development of new electrode technologies, new cell materials, the development of net zero production systems for the batteries themselves. That is a huge issue, that the production and manufacture of batteries is hugely carbon intensive. The development of intelligent battery management solutions and the evolution of things that we would call structural batteries, the battery that is inherently part of the body structure. But we have and continue to encounter inevitable problems with the range of the battery electric buses and the flexibility of the battery variants. And this is where the fuel cell options have started to become a really attractive offering. How do we service those longer ranges, the heavier duty cycles, or areas where we maybe just don't have the infrastructure to support the battery electric charging infrastructure that's required? So we'll start to look a little bit at hydrogen itself. So the specific energy of hydrogen is approximately 40,000 watt hours per kilogram, and that's stacked up about 170 to 280 watt hours per kilogram for a lithium ion battery. So on paper, hydrogen has 236 times more energy per kilogram than the battery technologies we're currently heavily reliant on today. So on paper, there is an argument that hydrogen is a much better solution than the battery electric variant on these grounds alone. They have the parity and operational range with an internal combustion engine, and they're much more flexible when it comes to refueling, because it's refueling like we're used to with a diesel car. Stick in the refueling, you go to a refueling station, it becomes an easier overall operational demand to meet. It's the securing of the hydrogen that's the problem. And I did kind of spot a comment just before I started about the different colors of hydrogen. So globally, the production of hydrogen every year is responsible for somewhere in the region of about 840 metric tons of carbon dioxide, because we're heavily reliant on highly carbon intensive processes where we're using natural gas sources. So this type of hydrogen is the thing that we call grey hydrogen. And today about 90% of global hydrogen is produced that way. This is far from clean, it's far from carbon neutral, and it's far from zero emission. And I think just to put that number in context, the total annual emissions of the carbon dioxide associated with the production of grey hydrogen is greater than the total annual emissions of carbon dioxide of the United Kingdom. So this is a massive problem. However, there has been significant work ongoing to try and create the cleaner production methods that will allow us to move towards zero emission green hydrogen, but they're currently cost prohibitive. And it means that when we start to look at those two technology solutions, the battery and the fuel cell, while the fuel cell is more flexible, while it has the range advantages, the total cost of ownership is significantly higher than what we would expect to see for the battery electric. And again, just to put some numbers around that grey hydrogen, the hydrogen that's been produced from natural gas, it's currently sitting between 70 cents and $2.20 a kilogram. And that's not expected to change massively unless there's a huge change in the marketplace. If we look at the green hydrogen comparator, it's sitting between $3 and $6.50 a kilogram. That's that kind of hydrogen being produced through water electrolysis driven by renewable energy sources. The cost differential is enormous, and it is really impacting on the uptake and making a huge barrier to widespread uptake. That doesn't mean, however, that there hasn't been changes. So these roadmaps were put together kind of early 2020, and there's already been a bit of a shift. At that point in time, we would be talking about kind of widespread uptake of urban fuel cells, maybe only really 2028, heading to 2030. That's now kind of 2 years on, being pulled back to 2025. And this is kind of where Queens is sitting in terms of the work that we're involved in and the types of technologies we have been working in partnership with our local manufacturer in the development of, how we develop underpinning modelling methodologies and technologies that are allowing us to optimise these future bus powertrains. And this is becoming increasingly complicated over the years. We initially started working with RITES over 20 years ago. We were looking at the efficiency of a diesel engine, how you started to integrate that into a bus chassis. That has moved and evolved into understanding series hybrid powertrain control and optimization, the development of micro mild hybrid technologies, and then how we've escalated that across into battery and fuel cell electric technologies. The extension from being concerned about how much diesel is consumed to now really needing to understand the full life cycle implications of a new energy solution, from point of production of your energy input through to the final disposal of the vehicle. And that's even starting to go as far as what is going to be the implication of the introduction of autonomous systems. While autonomy and the increase from SAE level 3 and further on is becoming commonplace in automotive, we're further behind in the bus sector, but that is starting to grow in prevalence as well. So at the heart of where we're sitting, it's really understanding the role of all of these different technologies and how they work together to deliver on our key objective, how we secure that sustainable transportation system of the future that is needed to underpin society. And what you can see kind of in our own major project pipeline, that a lot of what we're doing in terms of technological development, these modeling methodologies, these advanced control strategies, understanding the integration of these power systems is very much mirroring the demands and pipelines. So 2017, major funding, which was looking at hybrid electric powertrain and how we could leverage, increasing levels of electrification to offset diesel consumption. Moving in 2018 into full electrification. 2019, moving into how do we explore the wider implications in a big societal infrastructure, society, policy-driven network. And then more recently in 2020 and 2021 into the fuel cell variants. When it comes to looking at the fuel cells themselves, for any of you who potentially work in the domain of Simulink, you may understand kind of the challenges with trying to show some results from Simulink models and the types of things that we do. So a lot of our modeling is Simulink and MATLAB driven. I figured it was much more interesting to actually show the end result. So we're not just kind of working, certainly within Queens, on the mathematical models and principles, it's being translated into the final solution. So you can see two examples of vehicles over the last kind of 12 months, single deck and double deck hydrogen vehicles, where the Queens models that we've been developing for powertrain optimization, simulation, understanding the intersection of the energy systems on board the vehicles have been used in the design. So the types of things that we're considering here is on board these vehicles, how do we use the onboard energy systems? Because typically we're looking at a fuel cell, which is consuming hydrogen, working in tandem with a battery. How do we manage those two energy systems in tandem with one another so that we optimize the overall energy consumption for its use case? And then starting to extend into advanced and predictive energy management systems. And how can we start to leverage technology such as model predictive control to manage the kind of real-time energy management problem? The evolution moving from the carbon footprint, touched on this a little bit in the last slide, about this notion of grey versus blue versus green hydrogen and all of the implications that actually has for the carbon footprint of these vehicles and these new technologies. Because realistically, there's no point in having a nice shiny vehicle that has zero emissions if you have highly carbon intensive fuel being pumped into it. So again, moving outside of the traditional boundaries of the vehicle manufacturer and really understanding that full ecosystem. And that's extended into understanding our passengers, starting to look at our policy, working very closely with colleagues who work in green policy and political transformations, Professor John Barry, in understanding how we, from the engineering perspective, interact with people who are setting policy. And then kind of even more future looking beyond that, how do we start to leverage other emerging technologies in V2X, vehicle sensing technologies, smart city technologies, and ultimately moving towards an Internet of Vehicle, where our vehicle, our bus vehicle, becomes another sensor node within a wider interconnected network. And all of these things, because it's very easy when we talk about hydrogen for it to become a, that's great, you work on the hydrogen supply in the vehicle, but not necessarily where it fits in a wider ICT network. There are lots and lots of other underpinning enabling technologies that need to be in place so that we can actually deploy these future hydrogen vehicles properly. We need to be able to manage our supply and demand problem. There are major issues there in terms of how we sequence and how we actually start to ensure that the hydrogen that we need is in the right place at the right time. How do we leverage the onboard telemetry more effectively and efficiently so that we can really understand some of these vehicles, which are very unknown, much more strongly than we do today, but in a way that we don't end up drowning in data? How can we start to move towards predictive maintenance environments when our technologies are relatively unknown? And how can we start to harness those kind of future benefits of emerging V2X? And pervading through everything, it's how do we transition to end-to-end mobility services where we'll start to see vehicles operating in these next generation city designs. So that's kind of just a brief overview of the extent and scale of the problems that we're starting to see when we transition to introducing hydrogen into public transport. And as I said at the outset, potentially starting to stimulate more questions than posing solutions, but just giving a kind of an overall flavour and feel of the work that we're engaged in with Queens. The pandemic that we've had has not been a solution for climate change. What it has done is provided us with an opportunity to sit back and to reflect on how we can actually undertake a complete transformation of our industrial energy and transport systems. And I firmly believe that hydrogen has a very significant role to play in that future.